This is the Reason Interview with Nick Gillespie. Please rate and review and subscribe to this podcast at Reason.com, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you're finding it. And share it with people you think might find it engaging, interesting, provocative, or even aggravating. My guest today is Nico Perrino. He's an executive vice president at FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. He's also the director of the excellent 2020 documentary, The Mighty Ira, about the longtime head of the ACLU, Ira Glasser, and he's the author of a forthcoming book in 2026 on the triumph of civil libertarians. Nico is also host of the popular podcast, So to Speak, which bills itself as an uncensored look at the world of free expression through the law, philosophy, and stories that define your right to free speech. I talked with him about the Biden administration's rotten record on speech, his hopes and fears for Donald Trump's second term, and why he worries that when it comes to speech, Elon Musk is, quote, suffering from the curse of power, which is censorship, close quote. Here is the Reason Interview with Nico Perrino. Nico Perrino of FIRE, thanks for talking to Reason.
Nick, always happy to be here.
You told Spin Magazine a couple years ago in a great interview that, and I'm quoting you here, that government is always the greatest threat to free speech. With that as a starting point, let's do a quick check-in on the Biden administration or federal and local and state governments over the past 4 years, which seemed like we were getting in an increasingly censorious or censorial, I'm never sure which adjective to use, era. But how was the Biden administration and the federal government on speech over the past 4 years?
It's a great question, Nick. And I think the best way to frame this up is to walk you through FIRE's thinking ahead of the election. Because at least from our perspective, we had the sense that a Kamala Harris administration would be very similar to a Biden administration on speech. And our biggest concern there was their effort to police mis and disinformation. If you look at some of the broader international surveys, including surveys here in the United States, you found that mis and disinformation was a top concern for people. Although when you ask them who the biggest threats were or biggest spreaders of mis and disinformation were, they often pointed to the government, which is a bit curious. Who did they think was going to police mis and disinformation in the first place? So we were concerned that there would be a continuation in the Kamala Harris administration of policing mis and disinformation. And we were also concerned that hate speech regulation, or at least attempts to regulate hate speech, would be wrapped up in that. You might recall that some clips of Tim Walz, Kamala Harris's vice presidential candidate, cropped up where he talked about hate speech not being protected by the First Amendment's free speech protections. That's not true. The Supreme Court has continuously found that hate speech is protected by the First Amendment. So that's what we were gearing up for in a Kamala Harris administration. We were also concerned in a Kamala Harris administration about the continuation of jawboning, that is using federal or state or local pressure to force private companies to censor. You saw a little bit of this during COVID that prompted the Murphy v. Missouri litigation up at the Supreme Court. The Biden,
which ultimately held that what the government was doing was kind of okay, right?
Not necessarily. It found that the plaintiffs in those cases did not have standing, which means that the connection between the federal pressure, that is the Biden administration's health officials talking to Meta and Amazon, for example, we found in some of the discovery documents, and essentially pressuring them in the case of Amazon to remove books or Meta to remove posts. The connection between that pressure and the individual plaintiffs in the cases, the people who had their posts taken down, wasn't strong enough. So FIRE has been saying that Meta should have sued. Meta would have had a good standing claim.
Oh, okay. So, I mean, am I wrong then? For some reason, I thought that they had the court had intimated that, there are potential issues, but that nothing there went so far. It was just simply an issue of standing.
Yeah, it was an issue of drawing that close connection between the government pressure and the actual private censorship, which you
Yeah.
did find in the NRA v. Vulo case. This was the case involving New York State's health regulator that put pressure on banks to drop the National Rifle Association as a client. And you'll recall in the Supreme Court's ruling in that case that the government connection between the censorship and the private action was strong enough. And the court held that what the health policy makers or insurance regulators, I should say, in the state of New York were doing was unconstitutional.
How seriously should we have taken? You know, we at Reason we did a study of what we called the Facebook files, which was based on the Twitter files, which kind of came out after Elon Musk, and we'll talk about him later as an interesting. You know, is he good for free speech? Is he bad for free speech? I don't know. You know, but we'll get to that. But you know, what the Twitter files seemed to reveal was this extreme. If not jawboning, it was not always one directional, but Twitter people's going to the people in the government and saying, "Hey, should we, you know, is this okay to post, or how should we deal with this kind of information that's coming across our stuff?" Something very similar happened at Facebook, and where you saw a bunch of people who had been in a federal administration or in some kind of regulatory role now at one of these social media platforms. You know, how big a deal do you think the Twitter files or the pressure that became exposed related to Facebook and de-amplifying things, or, you know, or just squelching things altogether? How big a deal is that in terms of free speech?
Well, to step back a little bit, I think for your listeners, it's important to understand that these are private platforms that themselves have First Amendment rights. Now, the question that you're raising about a First Amendment violation or squelching of free speech comes into play when you have these private platforms that want to exercise their editorial discretion one way, but then you have the government coming in over top and saying, no, do it this way.
Yeah. Often
with subtle nods like, hey, we'll rewrite Section 30, or we'll investigate you in this, that, or the other way. I know there have been intimations, for example, that a lot of the lawsuits and investigations that Elon Musk has faced over the past couple of years, particularly under the Biden administration, have been a result of his political advocacy. So where there's smoke, there's often fire, but you need to be able to find the fire in order to actually bring that First Amendment claim. But I think for any civil libertarian, seeing how in bed the federal government, and in some cases state and local governments were, including the FBI, in Twitter's case, were with some of these private social media platforms is deeply concerning. And if it's not a First Amendment violation, it is a cause for concern with respect to the culture of free speech. So we were concerned here at FIRE, and we did a lot of investigating and commentary on it as well. But I would have loved to have seen one of these platforms bring a First Amendment claim against the government in one of these cases. They would have had,
but they almost can't, right? I mean, this is part of, you know, and I agree with you, and you know, that these are private platforms, although, you know, what is I don't want to say what is a private business versus a public entity, or you know, a broadcast network. That isn't shady at all, but the way these things operate has been changing. But it is, you know, it's deeply disturbing to recognize that the bigger these platforms get, and hence the more important, the more they also have to deal with political economy, where you know, with the government, and then also with their own workers, who oftentimes were the ones who were saying, you know, we need to get rid of this material. You had mentioned Amazon in passing. I guess this was during the Biden administration. It might even have happened, you know, during the Trump administration. I don't remember right now, but those stories about people at Amazon, you know, within the company lobbying to take down books on, you know, that discuss trans rights or trans identity as a form of mental illness. I tend not to agree with that position at all, but it is kind of like it's a private marketplace that is allowed to put up whatever books it wants or not. And then, you know, but it's wrong, I think, to say, okay, you know, we're going to suck every book in the world except for these 5 titles because somebody, you know, you know, somebody in mid-level management says, like, I disagree with that. It's like, Jesus. But there were a bunch of Republican senators who sent letters to Amazon saying, like, hey, you know, we're really concerned that you're not publishing, you're not selling the books we want. That's also kind of disturbing too, right?
Yeah, there are 2 points I guess I'll make on this. One is that I think it's helpful when a company is explicit about what its mission is. So you saw this with Brian Anderson and Coinbase. They said, we're not doing politics here. We're doing cryptocurrencies. So if you want to use our company as a vehicle to advocate for broader political change, it's just not the way to do it. We'll give you severance, but that's not what we're doing. You saw it with Netflix in response to the Cancel Chappelle campaign. They rewrote their policies on artistic freedom to say, no, we create content that caters to diverse audiences. So if there's a particular piece of content that you don't like, just don't watch it, right? We're not going to stop. We're not going to only make content for one segment of the population. Substack got a lot of flack for its free speech and open expression policies with regard to Substackers, but it held firm. And that's one of the things that we've seen in these cancellation campaigns, so to speak, is that when you're unapologetic about what your values are, it kind of puts the hunters at bay. They don't see that they can bend you to their will. And I when I say hunters, I mean the federal government and also employees within the organization who want to reshape the company in their image. So that's the one message that we've been sending to colleges and universities lately. It's like, figure out what your mission is. Is it the preservation, dissemination, and creation of knowledge? Hold to that, because I think a lot of the pressure that they've gotten recently from congressional committees and whatnot has been a result of the double standards that they've exercised in pursuing their mission, right? At Harvard, they have a Title IX training that says fat phobia is a form of violence. And then you have Claudine Gay get up in front of the committee and say that context matters when calls for Jewish genocide are at play. You could see how people would be pissed off at that double standard. But you also see double standards within Congress and within the Republican caucus, for example, that has been concerned about the jawboning and public pressure on private industry. You had 7 U.S. state attorneys generals that sent a letter to Target, for example, that said they were concerned by recent events involving the company's Pride campaign. This is a private company. They didn't like that they were selling merchandise that had pentagrams and horn skulls or other trans merchandise but it's a private company. How do you distinguish what Target is selling and its private right to do so from what Facebook and Meta and Twitter were trying to do? The double standards are ripe in free speech work, and it's the thing that pisses people in my line of work off the most.
So did the Biden administration, or, and I guess we're really talking about the Biden administration here now, did they do anything good to expand free speech?
Man, Nick, the things that they did that are bad come to mind: TikTok, misinformation, jawboning, hate speech. They rolled back Title IX regulations, which is a whole thicket we don't have to get into. There's the suggestions they targeted Elon Musk. I'm sure if I ventured into the cobwebs of my mind, I would find one or two things that they did good. But I'd say on net, it was not a great administration for the First Amendment.
Well, we've got a new sheriff in town.
Sure
who
do.
goes by the name of Donald Trump. And we have a new hype man for free speech in Elon Musk, who, bought Twitter and unsuccessfully renamed it as X. I'm curious to see how
Is that unsuccessful, though? I think people are latching onto it now.
Maybe eventually, but it was, in any case, Elon Musk is around. Let's talk about them individually. But what are your biggest hopes for the next 4 years regarding Donald Trump? Because he, when he ran in 2016, he said, "You know what? I'm important because I'm against political correctness. I'm going to speak freely, etc." He, recently or last year won a settlement against ABC News. He had sued them for defamation because George Stephanopoulos, he said, had defamed him by saying that he had been found guilty of rape when he had in fact been found guilty of a kind of sexual assault. And it's a very Jesuitical argument, but ABC News, coughed up $15 million and change in order to settle that account. He is suing Ann Seltzer, a pollster, and the Des Moines Register for publishing what turned out to be an incorrect poll showing that Kamala Harris was going to beat him in the Hawkeye state. Donald Trump also in the past has talked a lot about opening up libel laws. He talks about going after people, from the kind of White House. The White House has an FCC, it runs the FCC or appoints the FCC commissioner, who has also made, the new guy has made ominous remarks about networks that carry shows or edit things the way that, the Trump administration didn't like. How are you feeling about Donald Trump when it comes to issues of free speech?
Well, maybe let's start with the good, because I think that's how you began your conversation. I do think that the Trump vibe, and maybe it's not so much a Trump thing as it is like Elon Musk taking over X or Twitter or whatever you want to call it thing. But I think cancel culture is starting to wane.
Mhm.
I don't know that we fully appreciate how much Twitter, now X, was a driver of that, and how the vibe shift on that platform really undercut the main vehicle that so-called cancelers had to achieve their objectives. But I do think the whole Trump movement has something to do with that
Yeah.
as well. I'm not quite sure how, but I think it's all sort
Mhm.
of wrapped up. So cancel
And
culture was a big problem.
he did issue, I get, was it an executive action or order saying that the government, nobody in the government should be talking to social media people, right?
Yeah, he issued an
Administrators.
executive order on that jawboning
Yeah.
topic that we had discussed before. But at the same time, you have to wonder, like, Trump attacks MSNBC and says the
Mhm.
network shouldn't have a right to broadcast, which is a
Yeah.
curious thing to say because MSNBC is a cable outlet, not a broadcast station.
Yeah.
But
So it doesn't need a license. It needs no stinking badge, right? Yeah.
yeah, and then he said, for example, that Comcast should, quote, pay a big price over
Right.
after being irate about something that the late night host Seth
And
Meyers had said.
Comcast owns both NBC and I guess they're trying to sell MSNBC now, right?
Yeah, that's my understanding. There was
Yeah. And
discussions of Elon potentially buying it.
yeah, that would be something, right? And I mean, this gets into that weird thing of when you're talking about, when NBC Universal was the thing and Comcast and whatnot. If you are, you're a cable operator, but then you own content manufacturers and broadcast outlets, you got to pay attention to when the government threatens you, the federal government, because they can be like, we don't like what you're doing over here in cable, where we don't actually have a right to control you, but you also happen to own a bunch of NBC stations or
Yes.
content. You're doing stuff in areas that we can control and we can make your life difficult. So this free speech stuff, apart from all of the social opprobrium that people feel when they voice an unpopular position, the regulation of this gets very kind of sketchy very quickly.
Totally. And we are concerned about some of the things that Trump says publicly manifesting themselves in policy. Again, when you're talking about this public pressure on private industry with the implicit threat of regulation
Mm-hmm.
behind it, it's sometimes hard to draw a straight line from the statements to the action, but it's nevertheless concerning from a culture of free speech standpoint, if not a First Amendment standpoint. We know Trump likes to use that bully pulpit. So he, on the one hand, issues a good executive order on public
Mm-hmm.
agencies pressuring private companies. He says some of the right things about free speech and cancel culture, but again, he'll go after the press, MSNBC or Comcast. He says that people who burn the American flag should lose their citizenship and be put in jail, and says that people who say it's unconstitutional are stupid people. I guess that includes just former Justice Antonin Scalia, who voted with the majority on
Right.
the two flag burning cases from the late 80s and early 90s. And I should remind folks, they thought they needed to pass, and I believe that they did need to pass a constitutional amendment in order to ban flag burning, which is protected by the First Amendment. And it only lost by one vote in the Senate, if I'm recalling correctly. So it came close. So I don't know what Trump means when he says it's stupid people who say it's unconstitutional. They had to go through the constitutional amendment process in order to propose it. So that's concerning. There's also the mixed results on TikTok.
Mm-hmm.
So Fire sees the regulation or so-called TikTok ban as a threat to free speech, First Amendment rights. Trump seems to have come around to that position. I'm not sure it's on a first principles basis as opposed to a political calculus, but he talks about, for example, the United States owning a portion of it. I don't know that he's thought that through, because if the United States owns a portion of TikTok, it's governed by the First Amendment. And I don't know that he wants a platform that can't do editorial curation or has to platform crush videos or pornography, which are banned, which are protected by the First Amendment.
Would you quickly speak to this TikTok ban? And this is, one of the great examples of just how confusing political lines get, because Joe Biden campaigned on a TikTok ban. He signed legislation that banned TikTok, and then he refused to actually enforce the ban before he left office. Donald Trump was against TikTok. He wanted to get rid of it. Now he's in favor of it. And then he too, though, refused to enforce, the punitive part of the law because they were supposed to have found a buyer by now. ByteDance. We went through a period where TikTok actually did move its American data, its data of American users, to a supposedly secure set of servers that are run by Oracle. Larry Ellison, who's somebody Trump is friendly with, the CEO of TikTok's U.S. version, was at the inauguration with Trump and things like that. People, and including a lot of Republicans, talk about TikTok as an agent of the Chinese government, that it is both sucking up lots of data that supposedly is held, on these secure data, or it is curating a feed that is perverting the minds of the young and other people. Why should people not be worried? Why should people be more worried by the federal government of the United States banning TikTok in America or forcing its sale to a non-Chinese agent than that the Chinese government may or may not have access to its data and control over the way that it represents the world to its users?
Yeah. So I think it's helpful here to back up a little bit and see the...
You do a lot of backing up, right?
Yeah,
you should come with like a beeper
in
in reverse. Yeah, no, I appreciate it, because that's the thing, right? Like everybody always wants to argue about this one, point on the head of a pin rather than taking the bigger picture. So go ahead.
And that's something that civil libertarians are uniquely good at, or libertarians in general, is saying, okay, if you make an exception in this one case, what does this mean for the broader principle? And when I look at what's happening across the globe, whether it's Brazil saying that it wants to secure its digital sovereignty by banning X, or when I look at Australia, which is issuing global takedown orders to content that's posted on X, not just within its territory, but globally, on the premise that its citizens can use VPNs or travel abroad to access the content. Or you look at countries like Russia that ban social media platforms within its borders, or China that has a great firewall that doesn't even allow the TikTok that we have access to here in the United States to exist within its borders. And United States criticizes these countries on the basis of our belief in a free and open internet. What leg do we have to stand on when we go out there and start banning platforms ourselves? This is the first time in United States history that a medium of communication has been banned by the United States government.
Mm-hmm. Does that include Grindr? Because Grindr was also forced to sell a few years back.
Well, yeah, it was forced to sell, and it did so, you can say under threat of the government, but in this case, TikTok didn't want to sell, right?
Yeah.
And so the impact here.
So there's a law passed saying you either have to sell to a company or somebody that we approve, or you're done.
Yes. And depending on how those laws are worded, there are various levels of First Amendment concern. Now, with the TikTok law, it was very clear from the legislative record that they were concerned about the propaganda, so to speak, on the platform, as well as the data privacy. Mm-hmm. Now, the fact that they were concerned about the propaganda or the editorial curation is a core First Amendment concern. Because while foreign entities might not have full First Amendment rights in the United States, we as users of TikTok have First Amendment rights to access this information. One of the core cases in this regard was a case called Lamont that involved people who wanted to get access to what's called the Peking Review, which was a Chinese-owned news publication. And the law said that they needed to provide affirmative consent to the post office in order to access this content. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's a burden on speech, and you can't do that. It's
what year was that? Roughly?
1965, I believe.
Yeah.
1965, I believe. So we as Americans have access to information. But when the case got up to the Supreme Court, they tended to just dismiss the content-based regulation of the law. Everything that the legislators had said about the propaganda and it's poisoning the minds of the youth, because that would raise significant First Amendment concerns. And they just focused on the data privacy aspect. But for First Amendment advocates like myself, the outcome of this decision is going to have consequences down the line. I mean, it's very much a content-based regulation. It excludes certain Chinese-owned platforms, for example, that do e-commerce or host travel review sites. So very much a content-based regulation. If the country wanted to do some sort of national data security law, by all means, you could have done that. But for the Supreme Court to sort of pretend that this wasn't also about access to information and people's right to speak out, I think just belies the facts. And you can actually see that this is a content-based regulation by seeing everything that's happening with DeepSeek right now, which is a Chinese-based company that does artificial intelligence. Apparently, it tracks your keystrokes, gets all the access to your data. It's the number one app in the App Store on Apple. Not covered under the TikTok law. If you look at the TikTok law, it very clearly is focused on social media companies that are owned by these foreign adversaries. You have to be able to post content, and other people on the platform have to be able to access content. So the law makes China free to access DeepSeek's makes China free to access DeepSeek's data, while doing nothing on the content side. So the fact that it's all about the data privacy, I just don't believe it.
Should we be concerned about data privacy, owned by China as opposed to a good American company, like Amazon or Microsoft or Apple or, whatever the FANG acronym no longer works because people keep changing their names or, they rise and fall. But is that data security stuff is that worth being hot and bothered about? And can it be separated from these kind of questions of content, which, seem pretty clear cut?
Well, I'm going to take off my First Amendment advocate hat here and just put it to the side to focus on data security and privacy, which isn't core FIRE issues, but I'll speak from my perspective as a personal libertarian, and we've got folks at FIRE from across the political ideological spectrum, but I come from a libertarian background. People know where their data is going if they're using TikTok. This is a voluntary choice that they're making to use this foreign-owned platform. And I think, as the justices said during oral argument, at this point, if people don't know that China controls TikTok, then they're just not paying attention. So do I personally believe that people should freely be able to give their information to foreign governments? Probably. And I think a less restrictive means in order to accomplish some of the government's goals might have just been a mandatory disclosure, right? Rather than shutting down the entire platform, have a pop-up that when you access the app that says your data might be accessed by the Chinese government. At least then you still have the medium of communication open.
Right.
And you have that full disclosure on the data privacy side, which the government said was its primary concern. And then you can let people just freely make their decisions, just like the people who wanted to get access to Peking Review back in 1965 could freely send their address and whatever else they wanted to the Chinese government.
And that's great too, that, in 1965, they're making a jump through hoops to get that, just as Mao's Little Red Book is being mass produced. I think it was by Bantam paperbacks, and was becoming a must-have item for every college student's backpack. So, these things are always so kind of arbitrary and weird. Well, let's talk a little bit about Elon Musk, because in that 2023 interview with Spin, you said, and I'm quoting, "Elon Musk is now the man with power, and he's suffering from the curse of power, which is censorship." What prompted you to say that, and do you still feel the same way?
Well, what prompted me to say it is what happened right after he took over then Twitter, now X, which was the deplatforming a number of journalists who had been critical of him, the shadow banning, or I guess explicit banning, of links to Substack, for example, which he saw as a competitor to X. And this has continued since then. He's deplatformed folks who say that they're doxing him, which he has a very expansive view of what doxing means. And I talked to Matt Taibbi about this, who did the Twitter files, and you might recall was became persona non grata with Elon Musk for some of the shared frustrations that Matt and I have about Elon's management of X. And Matt had told me more or less the same thing. It's like, when you have the tools of power, the incentive is to use it as a propaganda tool to advance your other concerns. This is just the curse of the censor
Right.
going back to time immemorial. Right now, if you open up your X's For You feed, the first 5 posts or the last 5 posts from Elon Musk are most likely going to be the first 5 that
Yeah.
show up. Maybe
And
not
he
censored,
always
but
gets, yeah, everything he gets like 40 million in reach, which just seems a little bit strange, right?
well, yeah, it's his platform, his rules,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And
So
again, which is that's fine, right? I mean, on a certain level, it would if he's as kind of wild and kind of unrestrained and letting his blood sugar spikes dictate whose blue check mark still counts or who's being shadow banned. It probably will hurt the platform. But what? Yeah, I mean, or do you think he is a force for freer speech overall, though?
on net, with a gun to my head, I'd probably say yes, just because of how the change on X resulted in undercutting cancel culture, which I
Hmm.
saw to be such a perverse motive within culture, within our broader culture, such a perverse force, I should say, within our broader culture. That I feel like has been put on its way out, and Elon Musk had a lot to do with that. So I'd say yes, probably, with a gun to my head.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a bit about the kind of broader free speech culture, which I know you guys at Fire talk a lot about. That there's the legal aspects of things which are incredibly important and vital, and we've lived through a period of in my entire life. I think yours too, for the most part, where the Supreme Court really has held the line and expanded free speech for the most part. Even at various points, Congress, when they passed, perhaps unknowingly, not Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act and whatnot, which really liberated the internet to become what it is today for good and bad. But you guys talk about the culture of free speech. I'm thinking, we a lot of people are talking triumphantly now that we're back in an era of freer speech, if not free speech. And there was a recent a bit on the Daily Show, right, which kind of a good arbiter of way back in the day when Jon Stewart was running it. It seemed to be, it was clearly he's a liberal, centrist liberal, or leaning left liberal, but he would make fun of everybody, and it was kind of great. And then when he left, it kind of became more and more doctrinaire, kind of just progressive and uninteresting because it was always punching in one direction. But recently at the People's March, which was a protest against Donald Trump, Robert Smigel, the guy behind Triumph, the insult comic dog, went down there and made fun of the people at the march as well as the Trump administration. And it seems like that's kind of a shorthand for what's going on now, where
Mm-hmm.
a lot of liberals at the very least seem comfortable saying, oh yeah, like we have a lot of things that we did that were kind of stupid and foolish, and we need to stop being snowflakes about everything and get on with actually arguing about stuff, disagreeing with people, touching grass, and kind of rethinking things. Do you feel like that's ascendant now?
It's definitely the vibe,
Hmm.
but I feel like I heard those same things in 2016 too, after Trump's
Mm-hmm.
first election. I feel like I've heard those things over the last decade.
Yeah.
It I'm not sure it's resulted in any meaningful policy shift on the left with regard to the
Mm-hmm.
culture of free speech question. So I'm heartened to see it. I want a culture that is less censorial. I think I tend to
Yeah.
use the word censorial rather than
Okay.
censorious.
Let's go with that. I like it.
Uh, but you need to put your money where your mouth is, so to speak. And it's easy to say those things when everyone's trying to place the blame for an electoral loss. It's another thing when you actually hold the levers of power. What do you do? And I think what we saw under the Biden administration was the policing of mis and disinformation, was concern about hate speech, was an effort to put its thumb on the scale of dialogue, what can and can't be said. When we talk about the culture of free speech at Fire, what I mean, and what I think we mean more broadly, is a culture that sees the value of norms such as curiosity, dissent, devil's advocacy, thought experimentation, talking across lines of difference, where our first instinct in response to speech we dislike isn't to find a way to censor or cancel the speaker, but to meet it with more speech. So this isn't to say that you can't hold vehement opposition to what someone has to say, but it does say you should probably think twice before you try and go and get that person fired from their job. That's a cheap way to win an argument. You're not actually winning the argument in that case. You're just trying to cut off that person's means to earn an honest living. Or a
dishonest one, right?
Or a dishonest one. I mean, however you want to earn your living, I guess.
Yeah.
But I think in a culture that values free speech, we try and solve our debates through argument and disputation rather than trying to get third parties to come in and mediate them for us. And I think Sigmund Freud had it right when he talks about how civilization was started when man first cast a word instead of a stone. I think that's what civilization is. We solve our differences through words. Now, boycotts, public pressure, all those things have a place. And when you're talking about culture and when you're talking about norms, the lines can get a little bit blurry. But on net, I'd like to see a culture that talks across lines of difference and isn't trying to find punitive ways to punish people for their opinions.
What two quick questions on this. One, you've invoked cancel culture, and it does seem indisputably, although ineffably, the case that cancel culture seems to be on the wane. But I'm thinking back to an early, kind of Twitter kind of storm, a tweet storm that really helped sink Bill Cosby, who was he was making a comeback. He had a special that he was doing, and he started advertising it on Twitter. He had an official Twitter feed that came out right around the time that the comedian Hannibal Buress started making fun of Bill Cosby and saying, "Oh yeah, go check out, the story of him sexually assaulting, people, women, mostly black women," and then that took off. And in his Twitter feed, it was just filled with people ranking on him, which is one of the great things about Twitter, is that it levels all the stars. The stars and the plebeians are all like in the same conversation. And that seemed, I wouldn't necessarily say it's cancellation per se, but it drove a negative perception of Bill Cosby.
Yeah.
And is that the same as hounding, the publicity director of Boeing, who got roasted and ultimately, pushed out of his job for having written 30 years before he became Boeing's comms guy an article about whether or not women should be able to fight in combat positions in the military? And I guess a roundabout way of saying, like, how do we know what is a cancellation versus what is bringing up the kind of information that is actually helpful to the public to understand who's who and what they're up to?
Yeah, when we're talking about cancel culture, at least at FIRE, what we're talking about are people who are canceled for what we would say is their constitutionally protected speech in the court of public opinion. Now, when you're speaking within the context of your role at a private company, you don't have free speech rights. You can you can be fired in at-will employment for good reason or for no reason. But generally speaking, we're looking at the speech at issue and whether it's constitutionally protected. When you're talking about Bill Cosby, there's this underlying illegal conduct that's at play that might lead to the cancellation in those cases. Now that raises, maybe not in Cosby's case, but in other cases, that raises questions of due process. Do you really want to have these allegations of serious harm litigated in the court of public opinion as opposed to a court of law? But when I'm looking at cancel culture, I'm looking at the speaker who has a minority opinion, dissenting opinion, and maybe even a majority opinion, but it's an unspoken majority opinion on trans issues or affirmative action or women in the military or even DEI itself. We've had professors criticize DEI and get fired from their jobs as well. So when you see people who are just going out into the court of public opinion, expressing their opinion, and then lose their jobs as a result of that, I think that's the most perverse aspect of cancel culture, as opposed to the Harvey Weinsteins, for example,
right,
who are canceled in part because of alleged criminal conduct.
Well, you recently on your podcast, so to speak, which comes out every other week and is an absolute great listen, You had on people talking about the University of Chicago's relatively longstanding commitment to institutional neutrality. That they're not going to speak up on every issue of the day as the University of Chicago, and that's a position which has gained ground over the past year and a half, really, in many ways since the October 7th Hamas murder and hostage taking in Israel took place. And there was a flurry of universities where both the universities or subgroups talked a lot about, they took sides in that issue in a way that alienated a lot of people. Is it a good sign that that kind of thing is happening, where you start to see institutions that used to be neck deep in weighing in on, this or that culture war issue or this or that issue, which may or may not have something to do with their core mission or core function, are saying, what, we're gonna stick, we're gonna shut up and dribble, kind of, so to speak?
In short, yes. We have received more requests for help and consultation from colleges and universities across the country since October 7th, 2023, than we have throughout our entire history. It's almost more than we can handle. Wow. And I think it's because colleges and universities are having a reckoning about how they've handled themselves.
And it's funny because this is after you guys rebranded to say, hey, we're not just about higher education.
Yes.
That was a great way of getting colleges to be like, no, we need you more than ever.
Well, it's funny you say that, Nick, because we had a goal within the organization over a course of 3 years to have about 50% of our media mentions focused on our off-campus work and about 50 on campus, as a way to demonstrate that we're really engaging in the off-campus work. And then October 7th happened, and the work was just consumed by stuff happening on campus. Now we have a delineation within the organization. We now do have people who are dedicated to the on-campus work and people who are dedicated to the off-campus work. But institutional neutrality is something that we actually announced our support for a few days before October 7th. It was just so happenstance. We were largely liked the idea, but we never came out and forthright said that. And this is because we believe that colleges and universities are institutions dedicated to the preservation, dissemination, and creation of knowledge. Now, there can be different colleges and universities, private ones, that are committed to other things like social justice. They're free to do that through their free association rights. But if you're committed to the discovery of truth, you need to have free speech and academic freedom. And the best way to inculcate an environment that preserves those freedoms is for the administrators and the deans to not take positions on the issues of the day. And it's a no-win situation to take positions on the issues of the day anyway. Claudine Gay, the former president of Harvard, for example, issued 7 different statements after October 7th. She couldn't get the politics right. She'd issue one statement and get criticized. She'd issued another statement, get criticized from the other side. And so if you're even just looking at this, not from a principled standpoint, but just a practical one, right, it's a good tactic. Just tie yourself to the mast like Odysseus, as the sirens come calling, saying, "Hey, I can't say anything here."
Does that work in case, in kind of more extreme cases, like the U.S. declares war on Germany and on Japan? Do we really expect, leading state universities or private universities to be like, well, we're going to sit this one out?
Well, it depends, right? It depends if their students are getting drafted. It depends if their researchers and their faculty are getting mobilized as part of the broader war effort. There is a carve-out within the Calvin Statement, which is a statement issued by the University of Chicago that precipitates a lot of this institutional neutrality discussion for issues that deeply affect the campus community. Things pertaining to corporate governance, or that threaten the core values of the university, like free speech and academic freedom. If you were to have a war mobilization and it resulted in censorship and they were saying faculty members can't speak on this, that, or the other issue, then that's one thing. I'd have a hard time. There are always edge cases. You're always talking about values. I think it's important to start from the premise that we're not going to comment on the issues of the day. But if a 9/11 happens, are we really going to tell a college or university that, no, you're issuing a statement here was a violation of your institutional neutrality position? I'd say probably not. And that's a challenge.
It is fascinating. Also, I just, for a variety of reasons, I'm often thinking about, kind of the internet and the technology that, ultimately gave rise to it and whatnot. And, this was a big part of the left-wing counterculture that the universities, both private and public, had really been taken over by the military-industrial complex, and that so much of funding was being given either openly or covertly by defense departments and things like that. One hopes that transparency fixes all of these things. So at least, if people are neutral, like if institutions are neutral, and then everything is known. And I don't know that I agree with you completely that a statement of institutional neutrality and an openness to public discourse and debate and civil debate gets us probably 99 yards to the end zone, but then it's always going to be a little bit weird, right? Or there are no perfect solutions in a kind of marketplace of ideas or reputation or anything like that.
Yes, yeah. There's no silver bullet when you're talking about culture, and I think institutional neutrality is one means that colleges and universities, and even companies, to the extent they want to abide institutional neutrality principles. FIRE has an institutional neutrality principle, where our core mission is focused on the freedom of expression. And unlike the ACLU and other organizations that do similar work, we do not comment on the content of the speech we defend. We won't defend the neo-Nazis, for example, in Skokie, Illinois, and say that they're abhorrent, objectionable, what have you. That's something the ACLU and my dear friend, I hope I can call him that, David Goldberger, who was the lead attorney in that case, who disagrees with me vehemently on this principle, would do all the time in the course of advocating the court of public opinion there. But I think colleges and universities, they also need to inculcate the values and the mission more broadly, which is difficult. Harvard is now asking it a question on its admissions application about talking across lines of difference. Who is someone that you've disagreed with before, and how have you handled that in dialogue? You can even do things on faculty to cultivate diversity of perspectives within departments, for example. So there's a lot of things that can be done with the culture, but it's going to take time to reform some of the practices that these colleges have engaged in over the past decade, and start seeing some fruits from it.
Yeah. So I referenced a recent episode of, so to speak, your podcast, which you describe as an uncensored look at the world of free expression through the law, philosophy, and stories that define your right to speech. That's a great episode. About a year ago, yet another episode that really stuck out for me, or stood out for me. You talked with Neil Howe, who is the guy, along with his late writing partner, William Strauss, define the millennial generation as such, and they've written a lot about generational characteristics. I guess thinking about that conversation, millennials, Gen Z, and that particular episode, you go into both the limits and the strength of what defines a generation, like what years, the demographics of it, as well as the kind of psychographics. And you yourself are a millennial, right? You're 35.
I'm turning 35 here in a few days. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. So, do Americans under 40 say, like roughly millennials and younger, and I guess the oldest millennials are now in their early 40s, but do they think radically different about free speech than old farts like I do? I'm a late baby boomer, edging into Gen X. And, that seems to be, something has changed in terms of a broad orientation towards free speech being a dominant value, or the first value before everything else.
There are generational differences when it comes to the appreciation for free speech. Before FIRE expanded our mission beyond campuses in June of 2022, we did a lot of focus grouping and surveys to figure out where the public is on free speech, who we can bring into this fold, this big tent that we're seeking to create to cultivate free speech values. And what our research found, and this was internal research, but I can share it here, was that there are, broadly speaking, three buckets. There are reachables, teachables, and into deepables. So reachables are people your age, Gen X, who are a bit older, who appreciate free speech values. Like if you're coming in cold with a free speech argument, you're probably going to get somewhere. There are teachables. These are folks, I forget the precise delineation in 2022 for the ages, but maybe let's call it 22 and younger, who are teachable on free speech values, who are free speech curious, but maybe aren't quite there. And I don't think it has something to do so much with their age, but rather their openness, because they had lived through a period of cancel culture that they were starting to rebel against. And then there's my generation, millennials, people in their 30s, 40s, who we identified as, and again, anytime you're speaking with a broad brushstroke, but generally into deepables, people that are harder to reach with a free speech message, whose opinions are baked on free speech, much like the older generation, but they're in the opposite direction. That free speech, as my colleague Greg Lukianoff likes to say, is a tool of the bully, the bigot, and the robber baron. And so when we were creating our marketing campaigns to bring people into the fold, we were tailoring our messages accordingly, and we had this reachables, teachables, and into deepables heuristic. So there are generational differences on free speech. That doesn't mean you write any generation off, but it does mean you need to approach them differently.
So if, I think like boomers and Gen Xers partly, and I know for myself, I took for granted, because by the time I was kind of a teenager and and a college student and whatnot, free speech had won pretty substantially. And, there were still the scolds who were left, but they were light from a dying star, the Tipper Gores of the world, who were trying to, limit, dirty lyrics and things like that. And I took for granted that, this is the world that everybody always lived in, where maximal free speech was a good thing. And then the internet came along, and it not only allowed you could buy George Carlin records before that, but then you could produce your own foul-mouthed screeds and publish them everywhere. And you were saying that the teachables were people who had witnessed cancel culture and were starting to be like, this doesn't seem right. They're growing up. These into deepables, what is it that shifted them away from free speech, like from a world of free speech into one where it's like, it's either one value among many that needs to be balanced, or actually speech is bad. Free speech is bad.
Well, I'm just speculating here. I don't have a definitive answer. I think it's largely the victory of free speech in the culture. We forget what victories we've won for free speech over the past century or so. You had Margaret Sanger, who was a leader of the reproductive rights movement, who was arrested on street corners for handing out pamphlets on every Tuesday and Friday during a portion of American history.
Right, about contraception, about how not to get pregnant in poor neighborhoods and in all over the world, but especially in America.
Yeah. We threw in jail 2,000 dissenters during World War I who were protesting the draft in the war, and often very milquetoast language that had no connection to illegal activity. You had people handing out anarchist or Marxist literature who were thrown in jail. And now you can go to Amazon and with one click buy the anarchist cookbook.
Yeah.
We have come a long way in the United States for freedom of speech. And that was a concerted effort, led largely through the institution of the ACLU, also Jehovah's Witnesses, strangely enough.
Yeah.
They were prosecuted in the middle part of the 20th century and brought a lot of cases up to the Supreme Court that won some big victories. And so there was a generation that lived through McCarthyism, that lived through Vietnam War crackdowns, that lived through the civil rights era and the crackdowns on civil rights activists.
And on gay liberation, feminists all had their, fights with the law.
Yeah. And so you had a whole culture that was brought up to see free speech protecting those minority viewpoints. And then you fast forward to the 90s, a lot of those victories have been won, and you're defending free speech at the further margins of society. You're looking at crush videos. You're looking at indecent.
Explain what a crush video is for those of the audience who are lucky enough not to know what they are.
Yeah, they're videos essentially of crushing, killing animals, which the United States Supreme Court held to be constitutional in certain circumstances. So they saw they didn't live through the application of the First Amendment to these civil rights and social justice causes. But what they did live through, my generation, is the rise of social media, the confusion surrounding what's true and what's not on the internet, the application of free speech in the campaign finance space, or to other retrograde speakers like the Westboro Baptist Church, for example.
And God hates fags crowd.
Yeah, they would protest outside of funerals with signs that say "God hates fags."
Yeah, for
And so
military members, which is also kind of fascinating that their ideology just doesn't map onto any known portion of the globe, really.
no. And so they see all that and they say, "Wow, the First Amendment is just a tool of the oppressor.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not for this."
Yeah.
And that's how their opinion gets baked. Now you have a younger generation that lives through cancel culture, that lives through seeing their peers post something dumb on social media and have their lives ruined. They're saying, wait, I'm not all about that either. Now, again, this is all my speculation.
Yeah, right.
And I think you've also seen an abandonment of neutral principles that motivated a lot of the civil libertarian advocacy in the 20th century. That is, we're not pursuing political expediency. We're going to look toward the long term and stand on principle, even that means defending the rights of our enemies. That's what motivated the civil libertarians in the early part of the 20th century, and I think is unfortunately not the ascendant value at the moment. Jon Stewart had this famous saying where he said, if you don't stand on principle when your principles are challenged, they're not principles, they're hobbies. And I think we have a lot of free speech hobbyists at the moment. I think Elon Musk can be one of them. I think Donald Trump can be one of them as well. It cuts across partisan ideology. And when you have free speech hypocrites, including college presidents, people say, is this what defending free speech means?
Yeah.
We're going to defend it for our friends and not for our enemies. For our friends, they get rationalization. Our enemies get repudiation. Like, that's not what it's all about. And libertarians, I have to say, have been our best allies on free speech because I think they get these neutral principle issues, and they're not as closely tied to a political party as the left and right is. But there aren't as many libertarians out there as one might hope. That libertarian moment that was on the cover of the New York magazine, New York Times magazine, is come and gone.
It does it years ago at this point. But you grew up in Chicago. You went to school at Indiana University, which has had its moments of free speech battles, particularly because Alfred Kinsey was the sexologist taught there, and the Kinsey Institute is there, and that's always a firestorm. Or a lightning rod for issues about what is acceptable speech, even on a college campus, much less in outside of colleges. But how did you get interested in libertarian ideas and free speech?
Yeah, I should say first, the state legislature in Indiana and the governor are going after the Kinsey Institute again. They passed a law to defund the Kinsey Institute, and so that's still a work in progress. But I became interested in libertarian ideas and civil liberties issues largely through the Ron Paul campaign. 2008, I think many of my generation who gravitated toward libertarian ideas were motivated in part by what they saw happening in the Iraq War and some of the more broader things that Ron Paul was saying. I was a doctrinaire liberal, I would say, before that. Mm-hmm. But the Ron Paul campaign resonated me. I got to Indiana University and quickly became the president of the Young Americans for Liberty chapter there, brought Ron Paul to campus, read his book, Revolution Manifesto, and was really all about the libertarian ideas. I felt like for a moment their libertarian ideas were very much ascendant. There was a libertarian moment. And it was largely led by organizations like Young Americans for Liberty and Students for Liberty. I remember going to those conferences and just feeling the energy in the room. I'm less involved in politics than I was previously, just by the nature of my job at a nonpartisan organization, or even in political ideology for that matter. But my sense is that those movements have been splintered. Some have been subsumed by the Trump campaign, for example, which I do think is a net negative for the cause of free speech, because libertarians can be a pretty consistent constituency on free speech.
Oh, it's it's like water purification tablets or something. You gotta be dropped into things to make it clear rather than make it expedient when politics comes your way. Yes. I think you created you directed a fantastic documentary a few years ago. I guess it was in 2020. About Ira Glasser, who was the longtime head of the ACLU. That was the Mighty Ira. He is certainly a hero for civil libertarians everywhere. You've written, or you've been involved in critiques of the ACLU as kind of straying from that early mission of defending free speech, no matter what. And I mean, they really did. They, FIRE moved into the void that they filled when they started retreating from that, which I just personally want to thank you guys for. But you also have a book in the works. It won't come out until 2026. So, well, think about it. And it's called, tentatively titled, Triumph of the Civil Libertarians. And it's about how free speech advocates like Ari Nair, Eleanor Holmes Norton, Floyd Abrams, and others made the 20th century the century of free speech. Mm-hmm. Just as a final point, who is your kind of free speech hero? Do you have one, and why are they so important to you?
Oh, who is my free speech hero? That's a good question. I haven't thought about it before, but I guess the first name that comes to my mind is probably David Goldberger, who's the man I mentioned.
Explain who he is.
Yeah. David Goldberger was the lead attorney for Frank Collin and the neo-Nazis when they sought to rally in Skokie, Illinois, which in 1977-78, when this case was happening, was home to something like 6,000 Holocaust survivors. David Goldberger comes from a Jewish background, as you can probably guess, and he really stood up and advocated on a first principles basis for why you need to defend the rights of even my enemies. And he was not alone in doing that. Ira Glasser, who led the ACLU from 1978 to 2001, also did that. And so did Aryeh Nair, who's another name you mentioned, who led the ACLU.
And another name that I mispronounced, so I apologize for that.
I had to look it up with the first time I interviewed him. It's one thing to read something on a page and then to say it out loud, but his family fled the Holocaust.
Yeah.
Actually. And he led the ACLU for the majority of the Skokie case before Ira took over. And I just like David Goldberger because I think the philosophy that he uses in approaching free speech issues, and he's litigated other free speech issues at the Supreme Court as well, is one that probably most closely aligns with what we do on a day-to-day basis here at FIRE. And he's an unsung hero, as many free speech advocates are. He's not going to be a household name. I'd say the one thing he and I disagree about, and we have knockout, drag-out fights about it, it is commenting on the content of the speech that you're defending. And he thinks, from his experience in Skokie, that it really helps you in reaching audiences that are going to put their guard up by saying, no, I agree with you about the content of the speech, but I'm not defending the content of the speech. I'm defending the First Amendment, and the First Amendment is for everyone. I can understand that argument, and certainly it would make me feel a lot better walking into some rooms if I could throat clear before making the free speech argument by condemning the speech that I was about to defend. But that's just not how FIRE approaches the issues. So yeah, I've made that documentary, which was prompted by the funeral of Nat Hentoff, which was, is a whole nother story, a great civil libertarian from the 20th century.
And now you work with Robert Corn Revere as well as Greg Lukianoff, two people who have really changed, both the jurisprudence and the conversation about free speech.
Yes. So I'm very pleased. I think FIRE is the only organization like it in the country, insofar as how we approach free speech defense. And I have the privilege of working with some really smart and talented people who I greatly admire and who are going to leave a lasting legacy for all Americans.
Well, I hope so. We're going to leave it there. Thank you, Nico Perrino of FIRE, and the host of the excellent podcast, So to Speak. Thanks so much for talking to Reason.
Thanks, Nick.